Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to the Last Trumpet Teaching Ministry Bible School. This morning we are looking at lecture number 4 on studies in the Atonement. And particularly this morning we are going to stop a little bit at the attributes of God. Now, why on earth would you start with the attributes of God before you even go into the texts used for the atonement? Well, simply because this forms the basis of how people will understand the atonement. And what I'm going to do for you this morning is to show you how specifically the Greco-Roman influence and philosophy created a static concept of God, and out of that developed what we know today in the modern Western world as the atonement theories, that is simply based on that particular understanding of God formed way back, starting with Augustine. So it's very important that we understand God correctly so that we can come to the correct conclusions regarding his salvific work. And to do that, as I said, we're going to deconstruct a little bit what people think and understand and where does it come from. And so I want to just remind you this morning again of the following truths when we do study atonement. We can't study atonement as merely just the death of Christ. It has to be considered in the broader scope of things. Atonement entails the totality of creation and redemption. In other words, it was not just about saving man from hell or death. It's about total restoration of everything that became subject to decay. The totality of the person in the work of Christ. The totality of the person of the triune God, Father, Son, and Spirit, all involved in salvation. The totality of the history of Jesus Christ. In other words, I can't just look at his death. I've got to look at his birth, his life, his ministry, his deeds, his words, and not just the death, but the death and the resurrection and the ascension. So we look at the whole picture before we come to a understanding or conclusion about what atonement really is. The totality of many biblical and theological motives. The totality of participation is the divine participation of the Son in humanity and the human participation of believers in the Son. In other words, he became a man, he participated in our nature, and what does he impart to us? And how do we participate in that? And lastly, the totality of its provision for the reconciliation and redemption of all humanity and all creation. In other words, folks, when we study atonement, we have to consider a very broad spectrum of topics in the scriptures. We can't just hone in on just the death of Christ and think now we have come to a correct understanding. And as I said, in the light of this definition of how we're going to study atonement, we have to look at the attributes of God. Now, I've always taught the church that your theology must determine your doctrine. And what do I mean by that? Theology proper really is the study of God. A correct understanding of God must determine your doctrine. Your doctrine mustn't determine your theology. Okay? And so we see that your theology or your understanding of God in this definition is critical. And if that's so critical, we've got to understand how did people get to their understandings of God. And so I want to make the following clear. The misunderstanding of the attributes of God can profoundly shape and distort the interpretation of atonement, potentially leading to doctrines that are biblically incorrect and unreconcilable with the revelation of God through Christ. Now, what do I mean by that? I simply mean by that I cannot have Christ express a life, words, and a ministry contrary to what happened at the cross. if we say that he's the sole expression of the glory of God, when I've seen him, I've seen the Father, there's got to be a continuity in the motive and the actions. I can't separate what he said and did from what happened at the cross. The Bible offers a consistent, multifaceted picture of God, and any misinterpretation or misrepresentation of God's nature and attributes can lead to theological errors that affect the understanding of how Christ's atonement functions. I think that's very important. And that's what we're going to look at this morning. And as I said to you, I want to look specifically at the Western Church and where did they get their theology. And I want to show you how that really differs from the biblical Hebraic understanding of the attributes of God. Christ's vicarious humanity, sacrificial death, resurrection, ascension, high priesthood, and second coming are efficacious with respect to atonement because all are grounded in the person and Son of God, who became for us, human for us. He is the ultimate revelation of God. So in other words, we are saying that the expression of God through Christ must synchronize with our understanding of the unseen God. There cannot be a disjunction there. It must be the expression of the same God with the same motives, and obviously the death and the resurrection must be a culmination of that same expression. It can't be something different. That's all I want to point out. Certain misunderstandings of God's attributes detached from Christ and from a Greco-Roman viewpoint, particularly his justice, holiness, love, and relational nature, leads to a misinterpretation of atonement. So I cannot emphasize enough how attributes, or the understanding of attributes, predetermine an understanding of atonement. Because what you'll discover out of the Greco-Roman philosophical worldview that influenced Christianity, certain doctrines developed that was not necessarily taught in the early church. And when I mean early church, I don't mean 1,100 years after Christ. I mean early church, first church. Okay? And I've tried to point out for you the development of certain theories over time in the previous sessions. So, let's see why this study is important. Well, first and foremost, we have to understand the historical and theological context. How did this attribute theory develop, and how does that impact the atonement? Further, the philosophical presuppositions and biblical interpretation. What you will discover with me this morning, when I just visit quickly, briefly, the different philosophical views and how those philosophical views led to theoretical construct of God. You'll understand why this is important. We have to think about it. And folks, listen, the purpose of this lecture is not to try and accuse people and make them stumble, but to challenge everyone to think. To think, where do we get these doctrines from? Is it biblically correct? Is it sound? Do I understand it correctly? Because what I'm going to point out for you this morning is that philosophy has caused the church, particularly in the West, to come to a conclusion of a static, immovable mover that necessarily leads to certain doctrines that will stifle you in your spirit. Okay? Further, we want to look at the doctrinal coherence and then contemporary theology. How did we get to where we are, and how does it all fit together over time? Then further, we want to see the practical implications for worship and spiritual life. If I have this particular view of God, what influence does it have on my understanding of the salvific work of Christ, and what influence does it have on how I then relate to God? Because one thing you will discover with a philosophical concept of God, which is very static, which everything is predetermined and no real free will, relationship in the way that you and I understand it is literally impossible. And then lastly, we have to be intellectually honest and have theological integrity. If we want to be truthful, we have to investigate this particular point before we even look at the proof text um, on the atonement. So again, I think with just those few pointers, it should be clear to you that your theology will determine your doctrines. In other words, it's essential for us to understand why people think about God the way they do. And again, I want to highlight, as I pointed out in the previous lecture, the Hebraic understanding of God, which I will do, God willing, in the next session, is filial, relational, dynamic, involved, covenantal, familial. It's a family. It's a completely different understanding. Plus, they did not come up with a preconceived idea of God and then trusted Him accordingly. You have to look at it from a biblical perspective. The Lord took His people through things. As they went through things, not being spared, He acted on their behalf and revealed something of Himself actively, dynamically, and relationally to them as they went through certain circumstances. Okay? So they got to know Him not by virtue of a philosophy or a preconceived concept, but by personal revelation in a relationship. So they did not have the liberty to think of God whatever they willed, but whatever He chose to reveal of Himself. Okay? Whereas in the West, people came up with ideas of God which is almost a construct of what they think would be perfect, of what a God would look like. And we're going to have a look at that this morning. And then we'll see how out of a philosophical viewpoint they have a construct of God, and now afterwards the Christian West tries to connect scriptures to those concepts. Now, some of these concepts could be descriptive of something of God, but breaking Him up in some sort of a systematic theology with concepts has implications, and they are, as I will show you, very, very destructive. So just to begin, we are looking at the major influences on Western theology, and we can't avoid to mention Augustine of Hippo. Some say Augustine, some say Augustine, well, whatever you prefer. But Augustine of Hippo was the man who kicked it off for the church in the West. Because very interestingly, he is acknowledged by many people as the major influence in both the Catholic and the Protestant church. Coming from Manichaeism, Mr. Augustine, basically was advised to read philosophy to understand the scriptures, and he's a key player in the importation of Greco-Roman ideas in the interpretation of the Bible. And we'll see how it developed from there and how the church sits today with this inheritance of a way of thinking which they do not necessarily deconstruct. Now, folks, just for your interest, there are many books that I've used, and you are very welcome to write to me. I'll give you the references. As I said, at the end of the series, I'll give you a list of all the books. But for now, the Hellenization of Christianity, the influence of Hellenistic thought on usage and interpretation of the New Testament, and then in Plato's Shadow is the other one. There are a number of very, very good books and very good lectures online available if you are interested to go and study it further. What I'm giving you is a very detailed summary, and all I'm trying to show you is that the way these men thought about God was not out of a biblical Hebrew perspective. but it was influenced by the day and the culture and the philosophy which they had. And this necessarily brought them to ideas of God which is not reconcilable with the Hebraic view. And I think that is the important point. So, for example, Augustine was influenced by primarily Neoplatonism. Now, there are a number of philosophical what will I call it? Lines of thought by different philosophers of the time, but the greatest influence on Augustine was Neoplatonism. And so we get to concepts called divine simplicity, immutability, and eternity. Now, all these things sound good, but what you see is how those became the seeds of a bigger construct of God, that we end up in the end of the day with a God that is perfect, unchanging, impassible, unmovable, cannot experience anything, change his mind, because if he does, he's going to be less than perfect, and therefore everything has to be cast in stone. See, the God of philosophy is the God of human construct. He cannot be actively involved. He cannot change his mind. And so we hear from modern theologians with this philosophical concept of God, that man doesn't have a free will. Man is what he is, all predetermined by God. Everything is predetermined. Free will is an actual fact a delusion. And end of the day, everything happens the way that God wants it to happen because he predetermined it that way. This is a very, very contrary to Hebrew view of God. Definitely contrary. And I will show you that. So we see already here, starting with Augustine, there was an influence. I'm just a little bit later going to look at those attributes and how did they get to those attributes. Then under Augustine also we have the concept of omnipotence and omniscience. So why this is important, Augustine said God has absolute power over creation, and it came from Stoic influences, of course. And then omniscience, reflecting Platonic thought. Augustine argued that God possesses perfect knowledge of all things, seeing past, present, and future in a single eternal now. And that now it sounds all good until you dig deeper. And what later comes into view is that this omniscience is God knows everything because he predetermines everything, and nothing can change once he's predetermined it. And that's why he knows everything, and it's going to work exactly that way. So I don't know if that's real omniscience. Okay, because you only know it because you planned it ahead and you make it happen that way. With all due respect, folks, the idea is not to insult anybody's understanding, but to challenge you to think about these things. Where does it come from? It has a philosophical background. Again, I'm going to emphasize it and overemphasize it. People have a concept of God not as God revealed himself through the scriptures in a Hebraic viewpoint, but as they derive from a philosophical reasoning in their own minds. Okay? Then comes Calvin. Now, he obviously, it's very important to understand, Calvin picked up from Augustine. He actually quoted Augustine more than 400 times. It should be a clear indicator to you that his influence was in the majority from Augustine. And so we can draw a direct line from the one man to the other. We connect the one man clearly with philosophy, and then we get Mr. Calvin. And something that very few people understand is that Calvin had a particular view, and we're talking about atonement. Calvin and Luther were trained in law. So it's almost inevitable that whatever they looked at it from their own background and from their own legal training. And they came to some conclusions. Whether that be biblical, we stand to prove. But all I want to prove up until this point is that they had concepts of God which they inherited. You know, again, not to insult everyone or anyone. The truth is, folks, repetition of mistakes leads to perfection of errors. And so, if we don't question, we repeat something because all we do is we fall back on the fathers. Who did they fall back onto? Well, the next guy, or the guy before them, guy before them who said they were right. Where did they get their thinking from? If I am to be a Berean and stand before the Lord, I want to know. I want to question, because ultimately I've got to put my faith and my full trust in this. And so we are deconstructing all of these thought patterns. So Calvin was heavily influenced by Augustine and Stoic philosophy. That is an historical fact. Particularly the views of divine order and rational governance. Okay, so here we get now this absolute sovereignty. Calvin starts to develop this idea which he got from Augustine. Calvin emphasized God's meticulous providence and predestination. See, now we come into an area of thinking that developed from Calvin's concept of God that says, look, God's responsible for everything. Everything you see, good, bad, everything, God's in control. And God wills some to be saved, God wills some to be lost. Somehow God is glorified in all of that. Okay? Because what you already see here is a static predeterminism. Nothing can be active and dynamic. Nothing can change, because their argument is God is immutable. He doesn't change. He is impassible. Nothing can move him. And that's the prerequisite for him to be God and to be perfect in all his attributes. So in order for that logic to make sense, they have to now come to certain conclusions underneath that understanding, which is the only way that it can work is predestination of everything. Okay? So omnipotence and omniscience, building on Augustine's framework, Calvin asserted God all-encompassing power and knowledge, emphasizing God's exhaustive foreordination. Can you see where it leads to all the time? Where does he get this? I want to submit to you that this way of thinking about God has its origin not in the Hebrew scriptures. It has its origin in the philosophies of men. It's a well-known fact. You know what I did? When I studied this particular topic about the Greco-Roman influence on Christian thought, I came across a number of lecturers, philosophers who do not believe in Christ, who actually calls Christianity a Greek philosophical construct. Why on earth would philosophers from the outside, without any knowledge of this, come to the conclusion that the way that the Western Church preaches Christianity is Greek philosophy? You know why? Simply because they're right. It's their field of speciality. They look at the philosophies of Plato, Neoplatonicism, Stoicism, and so forth, and they look at what people preach as God, and they say, well, this is nothing but. And if we deconstruct it, where do we get to? Well, there's a history. Looky here. You can go read it up. These are facts that everybody can go and research. And we see how one man started with that interpretation. He filters the Bible through human philosophy and how it then develops from there. Going further, John Calvin also, influenced by Neoplatonism and Scholasticism, emphasized immutability and impassibility. Now, this becomes interesting. Calvin maintained that God is unchanging, preserving the Neoplatonic view of divine simplicity. Unchanging. In other words, when the Bible says it repented God that he made man, the argument is, hey, God's unchanging. It's an anthropomorphism. God's just using human language here, and humans misinterpret it. He actually cannot change. He can't repent. He can't change at all because he's immutable and impassible. Therefore, it's just human language to try and explain something, but all of that was predetermined. Can you see? It becomes a very complex, very confusing thing. How do you relate to that in a loving way? How do you relate to that in a relational way? You can relate to a mental construct by agreeing with it, but you can't stand in an intimate relationship with it. Do you folks see where the problem is? We are looking at atonement. What did the Lord do for us through Christ? That is determined by what do we think about God. And if I have a philosophical construct of God, which I inherited out of the Greco-Roman thought pattern, which came down the church and influenced the way Christians in the West think today, I am necessarily going to come to the wrong conclusion about what Christ did. It's for this simple reason and this big confusion that more than a year ago, a young man said to me, well, to me, it's retributive and restitutive. Yeah, because you don't understand who God is. It's because you bring in a philosophical view of God and don't consider it from an Hebraic view, because there's a world of difference and the conclusions are worlds apart, and that's what I want to make very clear. So the impossibility which was now introduced was, Calvin argued that God is not affected by emotions or suffering, aligning with classical theism, emphasis on divine perfection. You see, if God could be moved by human sorrow, if God could be moved by anything on our side, then he would change, right? Yes. I mean, really, why pray? You're very right. Why pray then? If God could be moved or touched by anything. So what do we end up with? Necessarily, we end up with a static concept of God. It's impossible, if you have these understandings, that there could be dynamic change. All you have left is to submit yourself to the inevitable, predestined, predetermined, absence of free will future that he determined for you. And if that's going to end up in the bad for you, then be thankful, because somehow it's glorifying him. As a matter of fact, this worldview, I've heard a man preach that it now pleases God to have people burn in hell and to have the saints look at them and rejoice and somehow give God glory for that. It has consequences. And the sad reality is, folks, ultimately you become like your God. Ultimately, you become what you behold. So a correct theology is critical when we want to understand anything. Further, we see now how this concept, philosophical concept of God, moved forward into Reformed theology. And we have now simplicity and immutability continued. They continued Augustine and Calvin's emphasis on divine simplicity and immutability, influenced by Neoplatonism and Scholasticism and Aristotelianism. Long words. Folks, I've done so much on this. I've got hundreds of pages of summaries. I've tried to condense it for you. There's so much evidence to these things that you and I just need to sit back and think, Lord, and ask, Lord, search me. Show me, where do I misunderstand? To be honest with you, I was taught at different theological seminaries. I studied at different places. And the sad reality is, 3 of the places where I studied have this as a course in the attributes of God. And so one would think that if everybody says this must be right. Until I started to study at other Bible colleges in Jerusalem. And I got to see how the Hebraic view of God differs from the Western view of God. And I had to realize I've also been hoodwinked. I misunderstood it in a big way. And that's why I'm a little bit militant about it. Because the way I understood it led necessarily to a misrepresentation of what God did for us at the cross. For example, I was taught that wrath is an attribute. Now, if wrath is an attribute, it will never go away. It can never be appeased. It can only be buffered. And so the picture that follows necessarily out of a misunderstanding of that particularly is that I constantly have to have Christ as a buffer between me and the Father, otherwise his wrath would consume me. And then I learned from the Hebrew scriptures and from Hebrew commentaries, the Lord says, my anger is for a moment. And it's also not the type of anger and wrath that we see from a human standpoint. Ours is the anger of a man doesn't bring about the righteousness of God. It's not even the same thing. Okay? And so what I'm trying to show you is we have humanistic philosophical concepts of God that we impose, almost force onto our understandings. And for that reason, we end up with the wrong gospel. So let's go forward. I'm trying to show you that there was an influence, there's a history. There's a history of Greco-Roman thought in the church. And people don't search it out necessarily. Further, there's this idea of sovereignty and omniscience, emphasized God's absolute sovereignty and exhaustive foreknowledge, reinforcing Calvin's deterministic framework. There is a key word, deterministic framework. Folks, if the Lord sends his Son into this world to reconcile us back to his family, to stand as sons and daughters of God in a living relationship, it implies active, dynamic, relational, covenantal involvement. It implies fellowship, but guess what? If everything is deterministic and static, how do you reconcile that? It's unfortunately irreconcilable, and that is a very important point to take note of. Now, I think what is important is that just in broad strokes to say, look, we had Plato's philosophy. So Plato's philosophy on Christian doctrine was specifically through Augustine. The concepts of divine immutability and divine simplicity were important legacies that he left. Then we had Aristotelian philosophy, which is something that imprinted itself on the doctrines that Calvin particularly promoted. The unmoved mover. Have you ever heard about that? The unmoved mover. Well, everything that happens is because of him, but you can't change him, you can't move him. The unmoved mover. It sort of says it all, right? And that comes from Aristotelian philosophy. So he's the first cause of all motion. He's the cause of evil, he's the cause of good, he's the cause of everything, but he himself cannot be moved, cannot be changed. It sort of ties in with this concept of immutability and impassibility. All these concepts hang together. They just have a slight other emphasis. So guys, can you see what I'm seeing? The consequence of this type of thinking. You see, currently in the church, in the Western church at least, there is a huge debate on this concept of a deterministic future and an unmovable, impassible God, or a God that's open and dynamic. And it basically comes down to the difference between Greco-Roman thinking and Hebraic thinking. We have to understand how that has an impact on how we relate to God. Can you see already with what I'm sharing with you, you start to think it definitely has a huge impact on how I relate to God. And that's exactly the point I want to make. Okay? So we further have this divine omnipotence and omniscience, and it goes together. The divine aseity, self-existence and independence from creation. He's this being over and above creation, unchanging, perfect in all his ways. Nothing can touch him, nothing can move him. This makes for a transcendent God. but not one that's very personal and near to me and very involved. You see, it's for this reason that people who stick to this type of philosophical concept of God can discredit anyone who talks about the Spirit near and walking in the Spirit now. Because the one is agreement with concepts. The other one is relational. It's being in agreement with a person. And that's the big difference. And if we don't separate the two from one another, understand what we're dealing with, we're going to come to the wrong conclusions. Further, we had Stoic philosophy. All I'm trying to do now, I showed you that there's a definite line, and now I want to show you the different philosophers and what type of Are we back? Sorry about that, folks. We live in South Africa, and the government decided to punish everybody and cut their power. Load sharing. So anyway, let's go forward. What we are saying is that there's a definite line, and we are saying there are different philosophical viewpoints that had an influence on this understanding of God. Kyk net asseblief man. Sorry about that, folks. We have all kinds of alarms going off because of the power. So let's go forward. Then we also had the influence of Neoplatonic philosophy. Plotinus and his influence on Christian thought, divine transcendence and ineffability, which means what? The Neoplatonic emphasis on the ineffable nature of the one contributes to the Christian doctrine of divine transcendence, emphasizing that God is beyond all human categories and comprehension. You see, it sounds good. Of course we know God is far above any man and different from any man. But what is important is that it also has consequences, in the sense that from here comes the logical conclusion that God cannot be understood, and therefore it's very difficult to relate to him. Let's go further. Then we have influence from the Roman side, and from the Roman side we had this legalism in divine justice. So from the Greeks we had certain concepts, but now comes other concepts from the Romans. So as soon as they started to imprint their philosophy and worldview on the early church, they particularly laid the groundwork for this Roman jurisprudence. And from there, the Roman legal system emphasized justice, retribution, and the satisfaction of legal requirement. I want you to see that. Please. This whole concept of penal substitution didn't just fall out the air. It's not found in the Hebraic understanding, as I will show you from all the best scholars, for example, are the book of Leviticus and the early church commentaries. It comes from somewhere. Well, the whole concept of jurisprudence comes from the Roman view of the world. Plus, you add to that Calvin and Luther, who were both schooled in law, and it's a perfect match. They will come to certain conclusions, right? So let's look at it. The concept of God as a righteous judge who demands justice became central in Augustine's theology and was later formalized in Anselm's satisfaction theory and Reformation theology. Now, folks, we're just not trying to slap something onto someone. There is a history behind it. We are not saying that these people individually first started these concepts. No, but they were the consolidators of certain ideas and the propagators of it going forward. So divine justice and wrath was one of the things that came through very clearly. God's justice was understood in legal terms, emphasizing the necessity of punishment for sin. This contributed to the portrayal of God as a righteous judge whose justice is satisfied through Christ's sacrificial death. So there's not relationship. He's a judge, there's a guilty party, and he judges his son. So that is from a Western point of view. But we get God introduced from the Hebrew scriptures in a relational way, even a covenantal way, and walking with man. Okay? And we get God introduced through the Hebrew scriptures as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of covenant, the God of the relationship, the God who takes the initiative to reconcile man back in relationship. We get the idea from a Hebrew interpretation that he is restoring us back to sonship. It's a filial relationship. And you don't get that concept in the divine justice approach, because all that's happening here is you've got a judge, you've got justice that needs to be served, you've got judgment, you've got justice satisfied, and that is basically where it begins and ends. And it has its origin particularly out of a philosophical view that emphasized God as a judge. Now, we're not denying the fact that God will judge, but when? Was the cross a point where the judge sat? Or does the Bible tell us there comes a day at the end when everything will be judged? You see, that's what we're going to investigate. Now, let's just look at it. All of this now had an influence on how we think. Folks, not one of these words you'll find in the Bible. Not one of them. And they are obviously philosophical constructs. They're words that put a concept for us together and to help us in a systematic way to understand. But is God relational and reveals himself, or is he theoretical and philosophical? I think it's very clear out of the book of Corinthians that he said, where are your philosophers? Man cannot know God through its philosophies. God has to reveal himself to man through Jesus Christ. And that's the problem we sit with. We have people who work with philosophy, thinking that they can construct an accurate understanding of God. And they discounted the fact that God is revealing himself and ultimately revealing himself through his Son. And the revelation of God through his Son cannot be contrary to human philosophy. Human philosophy must tie in with the revelation of who God is through Jesus Christ. And that's where we sit with a conflict. Okay? So this Greek-Roman philosophical thought pattern had an influence on Christian theology in the sense of omnipotence and omniscience, and it was derived from Greek concept. Okay, transcendence and immanence influenced by New Platonism, immutability and eternity adopted from Platonic and Aristotelian views, providence and sovereignty was a Stoic idea, unity and simplicity New Platonic. What am I trying to show you? These things did not come from the Bible. They came from the thoughts of men. And further to that, what does it mean now? Transcendence means God as above and beyond creation. But the Bible teaches us God is actively involved. Yes, he's above. He's not part of creation. He rules over it, and yet he is near us. Then We have the immanence idea, God present within the cosmos, which came from Stoicism later. Now we have omnipotence and omniscience, all powerful and all knowing. And here we have this idea of the unmoved mover. And I need to bring it in for you again. What does that mean? Do we believe that God is all powerful? Of course we do. But you know what? Semantics can make you stumble. Because what we sometimes understand about it and what is meant is definitely not the same. Because in the mind of many who are now overeducated in these philosophical ways of thinking, it simply means that he controls everything, nothing can change, everything is predetermined, and he will make it happen according to a predetermined plan, and it's static and cast in stone. That's what it means. Same with immutability and eternity. He's unchanging and eternally the same, so nothing can move him. He cannot be moved by man's tears, by man's pleadings, by anything, really. Unity and simplicity means absolute unity and simplicity. Providence and justice mean governs the cosmos with reason, order, and moral justice. Moral perfection and goodness, the source of all goodness and moral order. We don't have a problem with that, but when you mix them all together, you come to a conclusion that is very, very different from what we understand from the Hebrew. So, what am I showing you? Greek philosophy shifted from anthropomorphic, meaning something humans can relate to, God, to abstract, transcendent principles profoundly influencing the attributes of God in a monotheistic tradition. Let me say it again. Greek philosophy shifted from the anthropomorphic gods. In other words, it says gods, but it's literally our understanding of a God that we can relate with as human beings. It shifted from there to someone abstract and transcended, more a principle than a person. Okay? Profoundly influencing the attributes of God. Folks, we have to acknowledge this. There's something wrong with the way we think about God, and as a consequence, the way we think we should relate to Him. Haven't we seen this in the past? You become like your God. People who have this type of thinking about God are harsh, without compassion, self-righteous. They've made it because they agree with a certain concept, but there's absence of the spirit of life. And I'm not trying to bash everybody who has that particular view of God. Definitely not. I'm just saying, those who are really staunch in it, they have that type of a problem. Roman culture added a sense of divine authority, justice, and political order, reinforcing divine sovereignty and law. We have to think about it. Yes, that's where this whole legalistic thing came in. These cultural and philosophical influence laid the groundwork for later theological development in Christianity and Western philosophy, showing how divine attributes are understood today. That's the point. What are we looking at? We're looking at the study of atonement, but we cannot begin with atonement unless we begin with God first. Our theology proper, or our study and understanding of God, will determine what we understand of what God did for us. If I have this Greco-Roman view, I look at God as a divine judge and lawgiver, and He has to be satisfied. Justice has to be served. Otherwise, the whole cosmos is going to be in disarray, and it cannot be because He's a divine judge. Okay? And as a consequence, the whole work of the cross becomes a scene of a judge and a judgment and a condemnation unto death. Do you see that it necessarily follows out of your concept of God? The question is that correct? We are definitely going to dig in next week into the Hebraic view of God and see how vastly it differs from this idea. It makes much more sense, personally, to me. Makes much more sense. Now, what I did for you in the notes, and that's just for your information to read. I'm not necessarily going to go through it. I just want to point you to it. We're going to look at all these attributes that I just dealt with now, what it means, omnipotence. I'm going to give you the definition of it, then who came up with it, and what it means to the church. That's basically now a summary of everything I said to you up until now. And I want to ask you to please make the effort to go and read up on it. Okay? It should be clear. The point that I'm trying to make with these slides is I have the evidence that this I can't I struggle to say the church fathers, but the fathers of this particular movement, starting with Augustine, okay, were most definitely influenced by philosophies of the time, culture of the time, and that changed how they present God to us, and that changed how we think about what God had to do for us. I pray to God I make the case, and the whole purpose of this session is not to condemn anybody who thinks this way, but to challenge you to ask yourself whether you're actually thinking the right way. Test yourself to see if you're actually in the faith. Nothing wrong with that. So anyway, these are the points I'm trying to make. Where does it come from? Who was the philosopher? What did they say, and how did it influence the church? So these are the attributes and providence. And now I want to go to the next session or section of it. Augustine's impact on Christian doctrine, because that's what I'm trying to prove. So the attributes involved simplicity and unity, and what was the impact? Augustine used Neoplatonic simplicity to argue that God's essence and attributes are identical. His psychological analogy, mind, knowledge, and love, illustrates the triune nature without dividing God's essence. So all of this has an impact, and I'll explain to you just now. What is the point? I know it's a lot of information today, guys, but what is the point? Influence and ways of thinking. Okay, it wasn't necessarily original thoughts in his books. They have a history. Okay, now we get to original sin and the human nature. Okay, Augustine argued that God's omniscience included foreknowledge of humanity's fall but did not cause it, preserving divine goodness. Emphasized God's sovereignty and omnipotence in human salvation, introducing the idea of irresistible grace. Now listen. What happened because of Augustine and the philosophical influence on his way of thinking was he established the doctrine of original sin, influencing Western Christianity. Now, why is that important when it comes to the study of atonement? It is necessarily true that we are going to stop at that doctrine specifically, original sin, because there are a number of ways that people speak about original sin, but in the true meaning of the word, it's understood that man is totally morally depraved, does not have a free will, nothing good in man, he's born a sinner, and condemned as a sinner even as a baby. That is what is generally understood by this concept of original sin, so that people refer to vipers in diapers type of thing, and a baby being as guilty as an adult because of the fact that they're born sinners. Okay, that's a doctrine that was introduced by Augustine. Now, folks, why is that important? It is important because if Augustine was correct, it necessarily implies this double imputation at the atonement, meaning if man was a sinner, Christ has to become a sinner in that sense. So, following from their philosophical ideas to their doctrinal concepts that developed from their philosophy, it has an impact on the concept of atonement. By logic, it follows if original sin is true, then Christ must become another original sinner to reverse the curse. Can you see why it's important? I'm just trying to make the connections for you. So it's necessarily true that we have to stop at each one of these doctrines, investigate them properly. Does the Bible teach these things? I want to draw your attention to the fact that this doctrine was introduced by Augustine of Hippo, and it was later taken further by Calvin and Martin Luther. Anyway, let's go forward. Omnipotence, omniscience, and sovereignty. Again, Augustine taught that God, in his omniscience, predestined the elect to salvation, emphasizing unconditional election. Can you see what follows from concepts of God? It follows logically that if you make God static, if you place him in a certain position philosophically, you have to reason according to that same line of logic, in inverted commas, and then it's inevitable that you have to now come to certain conclusions. Again, it proves the point. Your theology will determine your doctrine. Okay? So I'm not going to go through all of that in detail. I'm just trying to prove a point for you this morning, and I'm trying to excite you to go and search this out for yourselves. There are so many good books about this particular topic, and there are so many good lectures on it as well. And there are so many lecturers, as I said to you, who will tell you on the internet, no way, Christianity is a Greek philosophical construct, because it is so clearly saturated in the Western Church with Greek and Greco-Roman philosophy that even a man in the world with a philosophical training can see that a mile away. Anyway. Then we end up with the other ideas of God coming from philosophy: omnibenevolence and omnipotence. Augustine argued that evil is privation of good, not a created substance, preserving God's omnibenevolence. In other words, what is evil? It's not something that God created, it's just the absence of good. Okay? It comes from there. And in that way, God cannot be blamed for anything negative. And the problem that I find with these philosophies, depending on who promotes it, some would claim these attributes to say God's not responsible, and others would say, well, God's responsible for everything. And so I got a bit confused in between when I used to study these things way back. Fortunately, now I understand much better. But back then it was about as clear as mud. Anyway, let's go further. So Calvin's impact on the Christian doctrines came with this predestination and election. Attributes involved omniscience, sovereignty, and immutability. So what you see now, and this is what I'm trying to prove with these pages. First we looked at the line. There's a definite line from one generation to the next that promoted these philosophical ideas and then filtered the Bible through it. Then there is the construct of certain ideas about God. And now what we are showing you is the danger is in the mix. Now they take these things and they put them together and they come to logical conclusions that leads to particular doctrines that has paralyzed many to say, you know what, whatever will be, will be. You know, no matter what I do, no matter whether I cry out to God, if I'm not predestined, nothing's going to happen. You know, and if he wants to save me, he'll save me. And guess what? Once he saved me, I can do what I want because I'm saved now. I mean, I've sat with people who actually claimed that. So I'm not just sucking it out of my thumb. So Calvin expanded Augustine's view by emphasizing double predestination. God predestinates some to salvation and others to damnation. It's rooted in God's immutable will and eternal decree. So these things become very interesting, and people will fight to defend this view of God. Okay? And what we find, folks, what I found previously in the series on atonement was literally a clash between people who have this concept of God without knowing where they got their concept, and people with an Hebraic concept of God. It will always clash. It will always clash because the one is based on a philosophy. So here it is. Historical influence formed the basis. This formed the basis of Reformed theology and the 5 points of Calvin. And it influenced the Synod of Dort, opposing Arminianism. And still today, people will say, you're an Arminianist. Well, I don't know Arminian, or I never met him. And I mean, I got nothing to do with him. I just read the Bible. Okay? People want to always polarize an argument. But the point is, this philosophical way of thinking influenced the Western church, and they're not thinking about it. Because here's the interesting thing that you will find in the church. You have the reformers, you have the Puritans. They all carry within them the same idea of God and of atonement. Out of those movements came other revivals, if you will, in inverted commas. They added new dimensions to their faith, but they didn't change core doctrine, so that you sit literally with a tree of movements today who still holds to the same core doctrine, which they never question. Okay? And that is particularly the church in the West. So anyway, going further, we now look at the different concepts mixed together. So you mix sovereignty and providence together, you get the following impact that it has on the church. It's all that I'm trying to show you. It influenced the Puritan ethics and political thought. So now what we have is, especially in the US, you see that in the Bible Belt, you have this concept of God, and you have this enforcement of law, and you have a very legalistic society, and you have certain convictions that it must be forced in a certain way, in government, in politics, in every way. And it sort of lost its kingdom view and perspective and purpose. Anyway, now, one of the things that we now want to get to is, so the question is almost, so what? Well, how does that influence atonement? The attributes which is justice, wrath, omnibenevolence, and immutability, now mixed together, had an impact on atonement. Calvin emphasized penal substitution and atonement, where Christ satisfies divine justice, rooted in God's immutability and justice, ensuring consistency between divine law and grace. I'm going to deal with how they explain atonement and how justice had to be satisfied, how grace could be given, and how that was all done in Christ. And literally what it comes down to is, if you will, a transaction between father and son, where the son had to appease the father's wrath and satisfy justice. And it's all based on a very particular view of God that has a history. Anyway, we're going to give a lot of criticism to that particular view. Now, I'm not going to go through everything in detail, but here is what I want to show you. In conclusion, the static God. The static God. That is the main problem I personally have with this way of trying to explain God. Number one, I don't think it's biblically correct to use philosophy to try and explain God. It's biblically correct to go to the text, the context, the historical background, and the interpretation of the people to whom it was written to, in that cultural context. We'll see there's a vast difference between Middle Eastern and Western worldview and how they understand. We, individualistic, legalistic, and a very specific framework, struggle to understand a culture that is bound together in a family and relational way, in such a manner that it's got a group identity instead of an individualistic identity. And we struggle. For us, right and wrong is important. For them, it's the honor or shame. And we don't understand how these things could be brought together. And that's what we're going to look at going further. So we end up with a static God. In other words, the ontology or the nature of God is impersonal and an abstract principle. That's what we sit with. In other words, Greek philosophy, especially Platonism and Aristotelianism, leaves us with a God that's seen as impersonal, perfect, and immutable. Folks, I struggled with this years and years ago. About 20 years ago when I studied these attributes, I had such a wrestling because it placed a damper on me. I couldn't believe that this God cannot be moved. He's so static. He's not even involved. I just have to agree with a principle or a construct. Plato's form of the good, an abstract, impersonal reality governing order. Okay, now further, in this nature of God, we came up with the immutable and apathetic God, meaning God is changeless without emotions to maintain perfection. Because if he feels anything, he's going to change and then he's not perfect anymore. Anything less than that and he's less than God. Anything more than God implies that he previously wasn't perfect. So it has to be static. Okay? So he's unmovable without emotions, okay? And then the transcendence emphasized God is wholly other, transcending the physical world and not immanently involved. Wow. Okay, that is what we are left with in terms of the ontology. Then epistemology, or the knowledge of God. It's rational, philosophical knowledge. That's in summary, guys. Knowledge of God is attained through reason, logic, and metaphysical contemplation. The mind of the flesh and reason, basically. And the Lord said, since you could not know him through your philosophies, okay? But the philosophical approach to God leaves us with an epistemology that necessarily means that I can know God through reason, logic, and metaphysical contemplation. It's no wonder that the church is filled with informed sinners. Because all they have to do is to agree with the concept and to agree with the transaction, but it doesn't transform them. Further, we are left with abstract and speculative thought. The emphasis is on an abstract metaphysics and rational speculation rather than relational or historical knowledge. We are going to look at the Hebrew approach next week, and it's so exciting for me. I'm just dragging through this side of the presentation. But when we get to the Hebraic view, I get really excited. Right now, I'm explaining to you what I personally got stuck with. My knowledge of God, my understanding of how he relates to the world, the cosmology, or how he relates to the world. He's the unmoved mover or the abstract cause. Everything that happens, God willed it. God killed this, God killed that, God caused that, God caused everything. He's the abstract mover. Okay? God is the first cause of necessary being, but remains detached and uninvolved in the world's affairs. That's what we're left with. Now, folks, I don't care how you argue about it. If you believe certain things that comes from the philosophy about God, from the Greco-Roman understanding, you're going to end up here. Further, the emanation and hierarchical order. What does that mean? Well, the world emanates from the one in a hierarchical order of being, diminishing in perfection. God is the source, but not directly involved in the material world. The further you go from him, the more or the less you see things that look like God. Static and eternal order. The emphasis on a static, eternal, cosmic order governed by reason or logos. That comes from Stoicism. In other words, it is what it is. It's going to happen the way it's going to happen. It all hangs together. How does God relate basically here? Well, in an impersonal, predeterministic way. That's how he relates. How must you relate to him then in that viewpoint? You just give over, man, and just be content with whatever you go through. That's the viewpoint here. And if you suffer in the process, then be happy. Okay? Now, I want to show you the key differences. The one is personal, the other one is impersonal. Hebrew thought views God as a personal relational being, while Greek philosophy emphasizes an impersonal abstract principle. Dynamic history versus static order. Hebrew understanding emphasizes God's dynamic involvement in history, while Greek thought emphasizes an unchanging eternal cosmic order. Holistic knowing versus rational contemplation. Hebrew epistemology involves experiential and relational knowing, while Greek thought relies on rational and speculative knowledge. Moral reality versus abstract ideal. Hebrew ethics are relational and covenantal, while Greek ethics are based on abstract ideals and rational virtues. Folks, if you put these next to each other, it becomes so clear to you that we have to acknowledge it and see how it influenced our thinking of God, because that's going to determine our thinking of atonement. So I've spent a bit of time on boring you with a little bit of understanding around the impact of philosophy, but it's necessary. If we don't deconstruct this, if we can't acknowledge this, and we don't acknowledge its impact, I can tell you it's a fruitless exercise to look at atonement from a correct biblical view, because this stays the stumbling block. You see, the people in Western churches that I've engaged with think they must defend these Greco-Roman philosophical ideas of God. They think if you touch it, you're actually touching the God of the Bible. But what you're touching is a philosophical idea of God, which is not the revelation through the Bible to his people in covenant, nor is it the revelation of God through his Son, Jesus Christ. We are going to end up with Christ, and then we're going to look at what Christ revealed of the Father, and then we're going to reconcile that with what Christ did for us at the cross. And God willing, we'll come to the absolute biblical conclusion of what the atonement is really about. I thank you for your time. God bless you. Amen.